started.
Hi there, bmac. It's Belle,
Matthew.
Maria,
Millie,
and Maggie.
here to tell you what's been happening from 1890 to 1912.
Empire and expansion seems to be the theme from everything that has happened from 1890 to 1909. America has felt that expansion to overseas markets and economies might provide some relief to all the labor violence and agrarian unrest that has existed. Even with the labor violence and unrest that has been occurring, the U.S. felt empowered by its new sense of power from the growth in population, wealth, and productiveness.
In 1890, Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, argued that control of the sea was the key to world dominance. Along with the publishing of Captain Mahan's book came the publication of James G. Blaine's Big Sister Policy to try and get the Latin American countries to open their markets to America.
While these majorly influential items in history were being made public, the first New England missionaries arrived in Hawaii in 1820. A bit later, 1895, Cubans began to rise and revolt against the Spanish rule. They burned sugarcane fields in hope that destroying Cuba would make it undesirable to the Spanish. The Cubans believed that the result of this plan would be that Spain would abandon Cuba or the United States would move in to help them out. To prevent this from happening, the Spanish put the Cubans in reconstruction camps so they could not support the uprising. In 1896, Congress passed a resolution that recognized the revolting Cubans, mostly because President Cleveland opposed imperialism and said that he would not go to war with Spain.
William R. Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer used yellow journalism to inflate the anger of the American crisis in Cuba. Restart. William R. Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer used yellow journalism to inflate the anger of the American crisis in Cuba, and on February 15, 1898, the American ship Maine blew up in the Havana port. The Spanish claimed it was an accident, a spontaneous combustion in one of the coal bunkers, while the Americans claimed that Spain had sunk it. America didn't buy their story, and war became imminent. Although President McKinley didn't want a war with Spain, the American people did. He ended up conceding to the American people, and he sent his war message to Congress on April 11, 1898. Congress then declared war and adopted the Teller Amendment. It stated that when the United States had beaten the Spanish, the Cubans would be free.
Progressivism in the Republican Roosevelt would be a great way to describe the years of 1901 to 1912. The progressive movement started at the beginning of the 20th century. It sought to use the government to improve human welfare and fought monopolies, corruption, inefficiency, and social injustice. In 1890, Jacob A. Rice shocked middle-class Americans with How the Other Half Lives, describing the horrid slums of New York. Henry Demarest Lloyd was critical of the Standard Oil Company in 1894 with his book, Wealth Against the Commonwealth. Around the same time, socialists and feminists were at the front of social justice.
Along with these changes, muckrakers, or reform-minded journalists who wrote articles in magazines exposing corruption and scandal became prevalent. In 1902, a New York reporter, Lincoln Steffens, wrote The Shame of the Cities, which unmasked the corrupt alliance between big nosiness and municipal government. Ida M. Tarbell published a devastating depiction of the Standard Oil Company, The Treason of the Senate, series by Davis G. Phillips in Cosmopolitan charged that 75 of the 90 senators did not represent the people, but instead represented railroads and trusts. Some of the most effective attacks of these muckrakers were directed at social evils. Also in 1908, race standards following the colored line showed America's blacks. John Spargo wrote The Abuses of Child Labor in The Bitter Cry of the Children, published 1906.
Among these events, an era of political progressivism was emerging. Progressive reformers were mainly middle-class men and women. These middle-classers sought out two goals: use state power to control trusts and improve the common person's conditions of life and labor.
That's right. They wanted to regain the power that had shifted from the hands of the people into those of the interests. They supported the initiative so that voters could directly propose legislation. They also supported the referendum and the recall, which allowed to directly vote on laws to remove corrupt elected officials, respectively.
The progressive reformers convinced Congress to pass the 17th Amendment in 1913, which established the direct elections of U.S. senators.
States began to use Public Utility Commission to regulate railroads and trusts. Around this time, Robert M. Lafayette came into action while governor of Wisconsin took control from the corrupt corporations and returned it to the people. And in 1910, Hiram W. Johnson helped to break the grip of the Southern Pacific Railroad on California politics.
President Roosevelt believed in the progressive reform. He enacted a square deal program that consisted of 3 parts: control of the corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources.
In 1902, coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike and demanded a 20% raise in pay and a workday decrease from 10 hours to 9. When George F. Baer, mine spokesman, refused to negotiate, President Roosevelt stepped in and threatened to operate the mines with federal troops. The conflict was resolved with a deal where the miners received 10% pay raise and a 9-hour workday.
Resources. The first step towards conservation came with the Desert Land Act of 1887, in which the federal government sold dry land cheaply on the condition that the purchaser would irrigate the soil within 3 years.
Although that was successful, the Forest Reserve Act of 1891 was more effective. It authorized the president to set aside the public forests as national parks and other reserves.
In addition to both of these acts,
The Carey
the Act of
1894
1894 distributed federal land to the states on the condition that it would be irrigated and settled.
In 1900, Roosevelt, attempting to preserve the nation's shrinking forest, set aside 125 million acres of land in federal reserves. In 1904, Roosevelt was reelected as president, and he made it known that he would not run for a 3rd term.
The Panic of 1907 was a short economic downturn that resulted in financial reforms. Congress passed the Aldrich Act of 1908, which authorized national banks to issue emergency currency in the event of a currency shortage.
For the election of 1908, the Republican Party chose William Howard Taft, Secretary of War to Theodore Roosevelt. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party chose William Jennings Bryan. Taft won the election.
Taft was not an adept political leader. He generally adopted an attitude of passivity towards Congress.
Taft brought 90 lawsuits against Truss during his 4 years in office, as opposed to Roosevelt's 44 suits in 7 years. Also, in 1911, the Supreme Court orders the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company, stating that it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. In that same year, the Supreme Court laid out its rule of reason doctrine. This stated that a trust was illegal only if it unreasonably retained trade. You didn't even let me finish.
In 1909, President Taft signed the Payne-Aldrich Bill, which placed a high tariff on many imports. Shut up, man.
And so,
It's not your turn.
This angered many Republicans because he claimed he would lower the tariff as part of his presidency.
in February of 1912, Theodore Roosevelt decided to challenge Taft for the Republican presidential nomination. They became opponents and Taft won the nomination, forcing Roosevelt to continue on as a third-party candidate.
Thanks for tuning in to listen to our summary of these events. It's been real, fam.
Sign off, question mark.
Lady, I'm gonna redo that.
You can say whatever.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to our summary of these events.
It's been real, fam.
It's been fun.
Sign off, question mark.
Come in. Say goodbye. Bye. Oh. We gotta
Bye.
do a thumbnail at
Bye.
the end where we're all
Bye.